The late July sun over Orlando had its own kind of cruelty, a relentless, suffocating heat that didn't just warm the skin but swallowed the air itself. Officer Anthony "Tony" Riley felt it the moment he stepped out of his Chevy Tahoe patrol vehicle. The asphalt shimmered beneath him, waves of heat lifting off the ground like the city was exhaling one long, labored breath. He'd patrolled these sprawling suburbs for 12 years. He knew the patterns, the heat waves, the moods of the city. But today felt different. Hotter, heavier, charged with a faint sense of unease that he couldn't explain. Even the vibrant crowds at the outdoor megamall on International Drive seemed dulled, moving through the thick air like they were pushing against an invisible wall of heat. Families dragged shopping bags across the lot. Teenagers filmed short videos under the shadow of palm trees. Visitors from cooler states walked with flushed cheeks, fanning themselves with brochures. And surrounding all of them were endless rows of cars, sun-scorched metal ovens with their windows reflecting white-hot light in every direction. Tony was halfway through his shift when the call came through his radio, slicing sharply through the usual chatter. Unit 7 to 14, be advised, second report of a distressed dog locked in a vehicle. East Side parking lot, near the premium outlet shops. Second report. That word gripped Tony harder than the heat ever could. 20 minutes earlier, he'd responded to a strikingly similar call. A terrier frantic inside a cracked open window while its apologetic owners insisted they'd only stepped away for 5 minutes. 5 Florida minutes could kill a dog. He'd warned them, documented it, and tried to push the memory aside. But the terrier's trembling, panicked eyes had stayed with him long after the owners left. And now, another call. This wasn't coincidence. It was danger repeating itself. And somewhere out there, a small life might already be collapsing under temperatures that could reach well over 120 degrees inside a locked car. He moved quickly, eyes scanning the rows of vehicles as he walked. The sun glared off every windshield, turning the lot into a blinding maze of light. At first glance, nothing stood out. No barking, no scratching, no movement behind glass. Then he heard it, a sound so faint he almost dismissed it as cooling metal, a tiny, fragile whimper. Tony stopped mid-stride. The background noise of the parking lot, the chatter, the car doors, the rumbling engines, dimmed instantly beneath that one heartbreaking sound. It came again, quiet, weak, a fading plea carried on scorching air. He followed the sound with growing urgency, weaving through larger SUVs and compact sedans until he reached an older gray car with sun-faded paint and a cracked side mirror. The windows were barely open, maybe an inch. Useless in this heat, a wave of scorching air radiated off the metal. The car felt like a sealed furnace. Tony pressed his hand to the passenger window. The glass was blistering hot. Through the glare, the interior was nothing but dark shadows. Still, he heard it again. A soft, broken whine disappearing into the oppressive heat. Something was inside. Something small. Something barely hanging on. He raised his radio. Dispatch, I have a dog in a locked vehicle showing signs of distress. Requesting immediate permission to breach. The reply came fast, unwavering. Permission granted. Save the animal. Officer Riley. He didn't waste a second. Tony extended his collapsible baton, planted his feet, and struck the passenger window. The glass shattered outward in an explosion of bright shards, scattering across the asphalt. A blast of superheated air poured out of the car, hitting him like the opening of an oven door. It stole his breath for a moment, underscoring the urgency of who was inside. He leaned into the unbearable heat, clearing jagged glass with his forearm before climbing carefully through the opening. Hey, he called gently into the suffocating darkness. I'm here. Hang on for me. No barking, no scratching, just silence. He swept his hand along the back seat, fingers brushing hot upholstery until he felt something soft, fur, burning hot, tiny, unmoving except for the faintest twitch. His heart clenched. He lifted the small body into what little light filtered into the car. A puppy, barely 8 weeks old, tan fur plastered to its skin with sweat, eyes half open and glazed, tongue dry and pale, breathing shallow, thin, uneven gasps that barely counted as breaths at all. It looked more like a fading ember than a living creature. For one terrifying second, Tony feared he was too late. Then the puppy's chest rose again, weakly, but enough. That was all he needed. He cradled the fragile pup against his chest and rushed toward his cruiser, where the air conditioning blasted cold air in frantic bursts. A small group of bystanders, drawn by the shattered glass, began rushing over. Water! Tony shouted, lowering the puppy onto the front seat. Anything cold, ice, towels, hurry. The crowd responded instantly. A woman handed him a cold water bottle with trembling hands. A man dug through a diaper bag for wipes and cloths. A teenager dumped her iced coffee on the ground so she could offer the remaining ice. Complete strangers, united by fear for a life the size of a loaf of bread. Tony tilted the puppy's head and dripped water slowly onto its tongue. The first drop slid off. The second rolled away. The third, a tiny flicker of movement. A weak lick. The crowd collectively exhaled in relief. Tony placed cool cloths on the puppy's paws and forehead, careful not to shock its overheated system. He spoke softly, voice cracking under the weight of urgency. Stay with me, little one. You're okay now. You're safe. The puppy twitched, just slightly, but it was life, fragile but undeniable. Minutes passed like hours. Then, slowly, its breathing steadied. Its eyes fluttered. A tiny whine escaped its throat. A sound so small, yet powerful enough to ease every knot in Tony's chest. Animal control arrived a few minutes later, and Tony carefully lifted the puppy into their hands, still trembling, still weak, but alive. Alive because someone heard a whimper. Alive because someone acted in time. Alive because compassion won against heat and carelessness. Animal Control's van rolled to a stop beside the patrol cruiser, its headlights cutting through the tense circle of quiet onlookers. The lead officer, John Robinson, stepped out with practiced calm, a man who had seen the best and worst of humanity through the fragile bodies of the animals he worked to save. Tony lowered the cruiser window halfway as John approached. How bad? John asked immediately, reading the strain on Tony's face before even looking at the puppy. Severe heat stroke, Tony replied, shifting so John could see the tiny body resting on the passenger seat. Barely responsive, maybe 8 weeks old, his breathing stabilizing, but he needs fluids and care now. John's jaw tightened as he leaned closer. One look at the puppy was enough. Good Lord. Who leaves a newborn like this in a Florida summer? No one answered. The question wasn't meant to be answered. It was meant to be felt. John reached gently into the cruiser and lifted the puppy with a tenderness that came only from years of rescuing lives on the edge. The puppy gave a faint, broken whimper, its eyelids fluttering. John nodded once, slow, heavy. He's lucky, he murmured. Another few minutes and he'd be gone. You got here just in time. Tony didn't breathe until he saw the puppy safely in John's hands. As they walked toward the animal control van, a commotion erupted near the mall entrance. Two teenagers, barely old enough to vote, were rushing out with wide, confused eyes, stopping dead in their tracks at the sight of shattered glass, police lights, and the gathering crowd. Our car, one shouted. What happened to our window? Tony turned, his expression cooling into something firm, controlled, authoritative. That window had to be broken to save the dog you left inside. The color drained from the teenagers' faces. Their expressions flickered between shock, guilt, then defensiveness. The last refuge of someone faced with consequences they never imagined they'd face. We were gone 10 minutes, one insisted. Try closer to 40, Tony replied calmly. We received 2 separate calls. But the window is open, the other argued. An inch doesn't save a life in this heat, Tony said. Each word measured. Not in Florida. Not ever. They opened their mouths again. More excuses. More denial. But the growing silence in the crowd cut them off. People were staring, their expressions hard with disbelief and quiet anger. John stepped forward, his voice steady but cold. You're being cited for animal cruelty. If this puppy had died in that car, you'd be facing felony charges right now. Do you understand how close you came? The teenagers had no argument left. They stood frozen as John carried the puppy toward his van, whispering something soft, almost like a prayer, as he placed the tiny body inside a warm blanket-lined crate. Tony walked with him, needing to see Bullet placed somewhere safe before letting go of this moment. Inside the van, the gentle hum of temperature-controlled air greeted them. John set the puppy down, adjusting the blanket so the pup was surrounded by warmth, not heat, but safety, comfort, life. You did good today, Tony, John said quietly. Most officers would have hesitated. You didn't. Tony didn't reply. His throat felt tight. Praise was the last thing he cared about. I just hope he makes it through the night, Tony murmured. He's a fighter, John said. And he's got a real chance now. Tony exhaled slowly, tension easing from his shoulders for the first time since he heard the whimper. He watched the van pull away, red taillights glowing like beacons of hope as they disappeared into the night. He stood there long after it was gone, staring at the empty space it left behind. Something inside him remained tethered to that tiny heartbeat. Back at the station, the drive back was quieter than usual, though quiet didn't quite capture the atmosphere. It was the kind of silence that followed storms, the kind that hummed with leftover adrenaline and memories replaying themselves in unwanted loops. The patrol car still smelled faintly of hot fur and melting ice. A strange combination, but not unpleasant. It reminded him of the exact moment the puppy's tongue flicked toward the water, a spark of life refusing to extinguish. Inside the station, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Desk Sergeant Miller looked up as Tony entered, noting the shattered glass dust on his uniform. "Rough call?" he asked, brows lifting. "Puppy in a locked car," Tony replied, voice tight. "Heat stroke. Severe." Miller shook his head. "Every summer," he muttered. "Every damn summer." Tony handed over his incident notes, then hesitated, just for a moment, before leaning both palms on the desk. His breathing slowed. The adrenaline was ebbing, leaving something heavier behind. "You all right?" Miller asked. "I will be," Tony said softly. "Just makes you think. About your dogs?" Tony nodded. "Max, Lucy, and Daisy." At the mention of Daisy, a quiet ache surfaced. Daisy had been his rock, his comfort, the silent companion who'd seen him through the loss of his father, long shifts, and harder days than he admitted. He'd lost her years ago, but her memory stepped beside him in moments like this, gentle, grounding, strong. "She would have licked that puppy's whole face," Tony murmured with a faint, tired smile. "Yeah," Miller replied gently. "Dogs have the kind of heart we don't deserve." Tony didn't disagree. He sat down at his desk and began the long, tedious paperwork. Step-by-step recounting, exact times, temperature notes, witness statements. The incident needed to be documented clinically, but as he wrote, pieces of the night kept slipping into his thoughts. The puppy's lifeless stillness, the first tiny lick of water, the trembling, resolute breaths, the feeling of a life restarting beneath his palm. By the time he finished the report, the station had grown quiet, phones ringing less often, conversations reduced to murmurs. The smooth hush of late-night hours settled over everything. Tony logged the report, gathered his things, and stepped outside. The Florida night greeted him, warm, humid, carrying the faint scent of salt from the distant Gulf. He leaned against his cruiser for a long moment, letting the air settle into his lungs. He pulled out his phone. His thumb hovered over the contact list. Then he pressed the number. John answered almost instantly. "Yeah." "Officer Riley." "It's Tony. Sorry to call, but how's the puppy?" His voice softened involuntarily. "Any change?" John's tone changed immediately, gentler, reassuring. "He's stable. Weak, but stable. We've got him on fluids. Temperature's coming down. He's sleeping." Tony closed his eyes, releasing a shaky breath. "Thank God. You can check in again tomorrow," John added. "I'll keep him overnight." "Thank you," Tony whispered. "Really?" He hung up and stood alone under the parking lot lights, staring at the quiet dark stretching across the city. The day had begun like any other. Routine patrol, routine heat, routine calls. But that tiny life, fading, trembling, impossibly fragile, had carved its way under his skin. It wasn't the first time he'd saved an animal. Wouldn't be the last, but something about the silence in that car, and the whimper that almost wasn't heard. It lingered, and somewhere between exhaustion and relief, Tony made a quiet promise he hadn't spoken aloud. He would check on that puppy. He would follow up. He would make sure this little life, this small, determined heartbeat, would never face danger like that again. Weeks slipped by in the kind of quiet, steady rhythm that only patrol officers truly understand. Calls, reports, early mornings, late nights, long stretches of monotony punctuated by moments that leave deep marks. But through all of it, one thought returned to Tony again and again: the puppy. His mind revisited the scene at the mall parking lot the way people revisit the memory of a near accident. Sharp, sudden flashes of heat and fear. The lifeless stillness of the back seat, the unbearable temperature inside the car, the tiny whimper, the trembling paws, the fragile breath that barely counted as life. After the rescue, Tony had checked in with animal control every day. Sometimes in person, sometimes on the phone, always with the same quiet urgency. "How's the little guy? Any improvement? Is he eating now? What's the vet saying?" And each time, John answered with detailed updates, patient with Tony's persistence. He's drinking on his own now. Temperature's stable, still sleepy, but strong. Fighter, that one. By the end of the second week, the puppy was fully out of danger. And by the end of the third, he was ready to go home. But the story didn't end there. The name that stuck Tony stopped by animal control the day the puppy was officially discharged. When he stepped inside, the small lobby smelled faintly of disinfectant and warm blankets. The soft chorus of animals waiting for adoption echoed through the corridors. John met him with a grin that reached his eyes. "He's awake," John said, "and very hungry." Tony followed him to the back, where a small playpen was set up. A tan puppy, stronger, brighter, alive, was attempting to chew a stuffed toy twice his size. His tail wagged uncontrollably the moment he spotted Tony, tiny paws scrambling with clumsy excitement. Tony knelt beside the pen, chuckling under his breath. "Well, you look a little different from the last time I saw you," he murmured. The puppy stumbled toward him, tail thumping, ears flopping. Tony reached through the bars and scratched behind its ear, feeling something warm spread through his chest. "You saved him," John said softly behind him. "Would have been gone if you'd shown up even a few minutes later." Tony didn't answer. His throat tightened too suddenly for words. "You know what the shelter staff decided to name him?" John continued. Tony raised an eyebrow. "What?" "Bullet." Tony blinked. "Bullet?" John shrugged with a small smile. "He came back fast from the brink. Fast enough to surprise all of us. And he's quick on his paws. It fits." Tony looked back at the puppy. Playful, lively, completely transformed. And he had to admit, the name was perfect. "Bullet," he repeated softly, patting the pup's head. "Yeah, that suits you." The puppy barked. Tiny, high-pitched, and undeniably proud of himself. Seeing the owners again a few days later, Tony saw the teenagers again, not by coincidence, but by requirement. They had to attend an animal safety orientation to complete the county's mandated follow-up for cruelty citations. They arrived looking uncomfortable but no longer defiant. Their arrogance had faded into something else. Shame, maybe. Embarrassment, a heavy sense of consequence. When they were shown the severity of heatstroke cases, they went quiet. When the vet explained how close Bullet had come to dying, their faces went pale. And when Tony walked in at the end of the session for final paperwork, both teens stood awkwardly to greet him. "Officer Riley, we just want to say, we didn't know. We're really sorry." Tony studied them for a long moment. Not as a cop, not as an accuser, but as a man who had seen genuine remorse before. And false remorse, too. These two seemed sincere. "Learning is part of growing up," Tony said calmly. "But you don't get a second chance with a life. Not a dog's, not anyone's. Make sure you never put an animal in danger again." Both nodded vigorously. "We won't, ever. I mean it," Tony added. They nodded again, slowly this time. When they turned to see Bullet, who waddled toward them with innocent excitement, the relief on their faces softened something in Tony. They kneeled beside the puppy, letting him lick their hands, apologizing softly even though he couldn't fully understand. But maybe, in some deeper way, he could. Bullet wagged his tail without hesitation. Dogs didn't hold grudges. They didn't cling to mistakes. They lived in the moment, forgiving in ways humans rarely understood. The teens left that day with their citation complete, their warning documented, and Bullet safely cradled in their arms, better informed, humbled, and carrying a responsibility they now understood the weight of. A future built on one miraculous rescue weeks later. On a warm Sunday morning, Tony found himself standing on a quiet sidewalk in a suburban neighborhood. He wasn't on duty. He wasn't there for a call. He was there because he was invited. Bullet bounded across the small yard, ears flopping, legs still slightly uncoordinated in that charming puppy way. The teenagers, more attentive now, carrying water bottles and shade umbrellas as if the sun itself were a threat, kept a close eye on him. Tony stood beside Daisy's old friend, a neighbor who had known him for years. She smiled at Bullet's energy. "He's a lucky little guy," she said. Tony nodded. "Yeah," he replied softly. "He really is." Bullet spotted Tony and ran toward him at full speed, tail wagging like it might launch him into the air. He skidded to a clumsy stop and pawed at Tony's shoes, demanding attention he knew he'd receive. Tony knelt down and rubbed his head. "You growing fast, aren't you?" he said with a smile. "Keep going, Bullet. You've got a whole lot of life ahead of you. In that yard, Under bright Florida sunlight that once nearly stole Bullet's life, Tony felt something settle inside him. A reminder, a truth, that compassion matters. That quick decisions save lives. That even the smallest creatures deserve fierce protection. And that sometimes, the moments that change us the most come softly, on a trembling whimper, almost too quiet to hear. A closing reflection, the kind that stays in the heart. Later that evening, Tony sat on his couch, the house quiet around him. The sun dipped behind the horizon, washing the neighborhood in warm orange hues. He thought of Daisy, of Bullet, of the moments that shaped him, not with grand gestures, but in simple, profound ways. Dogs had a way of doing that, loving without reservation, trusting without fear, surviving with a strength that seemed impossible for such small bodies. Tony leaned back, closing his eyes, letting the peaceful silence settle. Bullet had lived, a tiny heartbeat had been saved. And that single rescue, one small life saved from impossible heat, had rippled outwards, touching strangers, changing hearts, reminding everyone who heard the story of something essential. That life is fragile, that kindness is powerful, and that sometimes the most heroic acts happen in the most ordinary moments. A parking lot, a faint whimper, a window shattered in the name of compassion. As evening settled in, Tony felt something warm in his chest. Quiet, gentle, absolute. A reminder that every heartbeat matters, and that some stories, especially the ones carried on tiny paws, deserve to be remembered. If this story touched your heart, just imagine how many more we still have to share. Subscribe to Whisker Tales, hit the bell icon, and join us for every new episode of courage, loyalty, and second chances. Because every life deserves to be remembered,